It started with a small stumble and a touch that lingered just a second too long. Nathan and I were crammed together in the cluttered storage room, trying to organize the mess of old furniture and forgotten boxes that had accumulated over the years. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the faint citrus of his cologne, which somehow made the room feel smaller. We'd been at it for over an hour, and despite the awkward proximity, I'd managed to keep things normal, or so I thought. Until I tripped. My foot caught on the edge of a box, and before I could catch myself, Nathan's hands were on me, firm and steady, gripping my waist to stop me from falling. The moment froze between us. His touch sent a shiver through me, and when I looked up, his face was closer than I realized, his eyes searching mine in a way that made my heart pound harder than it should have. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Yeah, I'm fine," I stammered, pulling away quickly. But even as I stepped back, I could still feel the warmth of his hands, the weight of his gaze lingering on me. We went back to work, but something had shifted. Every brush of our hands as we passed things to each other, every accidental glance, felt like it carried too much weight. By the time we finished, my cheeks were flushed, and my nerves were frayed. "Thanks for helping me," I said, trying to sound casual as we stood by the door. "Anytime," he replied, his lips curling into a faint smile that set my pulse racing. As he walked away, I realized two things. One, I was in far more trouble than I wanted to admit, and two, I didn't want him to leave. Not then, not ever. When Nathan moved back home, I told myself it would only be temporary. He'd just gone through a bad breakup, and Richard insisted it was the right thing to do. "He needs a place to reset," he'd said, barely looking up from the golf schedule he was penciling into his calendar. I'd agreed, of course. What kind of stepmother would I be if I didn't? But I hadn't expected the way Nathan's presence would change the house. At 24, he was nothing like the lanky teenager I remembered from years ago. He'd grown into a man, broad-shouldered, confident, with an easy charm that filled the room. And while Richard spent most of his time on the golf course or traveling with his friends, Nathan was always around. Always there. It started innocently enough. He'd join me for morning coffee in the kitchen, casually leaning against the counter while we talked about nothing in particular. He'd offer to help me carry groceries in from the car or fix things around the house that Richard hadn't touched in years. But then came the lingering moments. The small touches that felt like they meant more than they should. The way his eyes lingered on mine a little too long. And then there was the storage room. That Saturday morning, I decided it was time to tackle the clutter that had been accumulating for years. Richard was off at some golf retreat, and the house felt too big and too quiet without him. I grabbed a pair of gloves and a trash bag, bracing myself for the mess I was about to dive into. Nathan appeared as I was pulling open the door to the storage room. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice warm and casual. I hesitated for a moment. "You don't have to," I said, though a part of me was already hoping he'd stay. "I've got nothing else to do," he replied with a shrug. "Besides, it'll go faster with two people." I couldn't argue with that, so I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The room was cramped, filled with old furniture, boxes of holiday decorations, and other forgotten relics of our lives. We started sorting through the mess, pulling out items to donate, trash, or keep. At first the work was mundane, dusty photo albums, broken lamps, faded tablecloths. But as the hours passed, something about being in that small, enclosed space together began to feel different. It happened when we were moving an old dresser. It was heavy, and I struggled to keep my grip as we maneuvered it toward the wall. "Careful," Nathan said, stepping closer to help steady it. His hand brushed against mine, and for a second I froze. His touch was warm, and when I looked up, his face was just inches from mine. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said quickly, pulling my hand away. "I've got it." But I didn't. A moment later, my foot caught on the edge of a box, and I stumbled backward. Nathan moved instinctively, his hands gripping my waist as he steadied me. The dresser clattered against the wall, but I barely heard it over the pounding of my heart. For a moment, neither of us moved. His hands were firm on my waist, his grip steady and strong, and I was painfully aware of how close we were. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my cheek, and when I looked up, His eyes met mine, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. "I'm fine," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't let go right away. His hands lingered just a moment too long before he stepped back, his expression unreadable. After that, everything felt different. The air in the room was heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to address. We worked in silence, our movements careful and deliberate, but every time our hands brushed or our eyes met, my heart skipped a beat. By the time we finished, the storage room looked almost unrecognizable. The clutter was gone, replaced with neatly stacked boxes and labeled bins. But I could barely focus on the work we'd done. All I could think about was the way Nathan had looked at me, the way his touch had lingered, the way my body had responded in a way I couldn't ignore. "Thanks for helping me," I said as we stood by the door, trying to sound casual. "Anytime," he replied, his lips curling into a faint smile that made my pulse quicken. I watched as he walked away, his steps slow and deliberate. The house suddenly felt too quiet again, and I realized I didn't want him to leave. Not then, not ever. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the storage room. Every detail replayed in my mind. The warmth of his hands, the intensity in his eyes, the way my heart had raced like I was a teenager again. It was ridiculous, I told myself. He was my stepson. This was wrong. But no matter how many times I tried to push the thoughts away, they came rushing back. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want them to stop. The morning after the storage room incident, I thought things might return to normal. I'd convinced myself it was just a fleeting moment, a combination of close proximity and a tired mind playing tricks on me. But when I walked into the kitchen and saw Nathan standing by the coffee machine, barefoot in a t-shirt and sweatpants, I knew that wasn't true. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made my stomach tighten. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady as I poured myself a cup of coffee. The silence between us wasn't unusual, but now it felt different. Heavy. Charged. I could feel his eyes on me as I busied myself with stirring sugar into my cup, my hand trembling slightly. "Sleep well?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. "Fine," I said quickly, though it was a lie. I hadn't slept much at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt the warmth of his hands on my waist, the way his touch had lingered just a second too long. "Good," he said, his lips twitching into a faint smile. There was something knowing in his expression, as if he could see right through me, and it made my cheeks flush. I turned away, retreating to the dining table with my coffee and pretending to read something on my phone. But even with my back to him, I could feel the weight of his gaze, the tension between us growing with every passing second. For the next few days, I did my best to avoid being alone with him. I busied myself with errands, chores, anything to keep myself distracted. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape him. He was always there, in the kitchen, on the couch, in the hallway, and every interaction felt like a test of my self-control. One evening, while Richard was out of town for a golf tournament, Nathan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. He was sprawled out on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, while I sat in the armchair with a book I wasn't really reading. "You don't have to sit all the way over there, you know," he said, his voice teasing. "I'm comfortable," I replied, keeping my eyes on the page even though I hadn't absorbed a single word. He chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. "Suit yourself." The minutes dragged on, the silence between us broken only by the faint sound of the TV. I could feel his presence like a physical weight, pulling me toward him. And no matter how hard I tried to focus on my book, my thoughts kept drifting back to the storage room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I closed the book and stood, my heart pounding. "I think I'll head to bed," I said, my voice too loud in the quiet room. Nathan sat up, his gaze fixed on me. "Wait," he said, his tone soft but insistent. I hesitated, my hand on the back of the chair, and when I looked at him, the intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing and taking a step toward me. "About what?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "About what happened," he said simply, "in the storage room." I froze, my pulse racing. "Nothing happened," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. That's not true, and you know it, he said, his voice low and steady. I looked away, my chest tightening. Nathan, we can't. Why not? He interrupted, his hand brushing against mine. Why are you so afraid to admit what you're feeling? His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Because he was right. I was afraid. Afraid of what this meant, of what it could lead to, of the consequences we'd have to face. Nathan, I said finally, my voice trembling. This isn't right. You're my— Don't, he said, his tone firm but gentle. Don't say it like that. I'm not a kid, Vivian. I know what I'm doing, and I know you feel it too. He reached for my hand, his fingers curling around mine, and when I looked up at him, the vulnerability in his eyes broke down the last of my defenses. Before I could think better of it, I closed the distance between us, my lips crashing against his in a kiss that was desperate and hungry and long overdue. He responded immediately, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. The living room became our world, the couch our sanctuary, as we lost ourselves in each other. His hands were everywhere, on my back, my waist, my thighs, exploring me with a mix of reverence and urgency that left me breathless. It was raw and intense, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just the overwhelming need to be close to him, to feel his skin against mine, to let go of everything else and just be. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, our breaths heavy and our bodies slick with sweat. Nathan's hand traced lazy circles on my back, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice warm and full of concern. I nodded, my eyes closed. Yeah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm okay. But as I lay there in his arms, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The guilt, the fear, the weight of what we'd just done. It all came crashing down on me, and I knew this was only the beginning. Because there was no going back now. We'd crossed the line, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning after that night on the couch, the house felt impossibly quiet. Nathan was already gone when I woke up, leaving behind an empty coffee cup in the sink and a note on the counter that simply said, "See you later." The words were casual, but the sight of his handwriting made my stomach flip. I stared at the note for far too long, replaying the events of the night before in my mind. His hands on my skin, the weight of his body against mine, the way he'd whispered my name like it was the only thing that mattered. It had felt so right in the moment. But now, in the light of day, all I could think about was the risk we'd taken, the lines we'd crossed. And yet, a part of me didn't care. A part of me wanted more. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and secret glances. We moved carefully around Richard, who remained blissfully unaware, too caught up in his golf games and business meetings to notice the growing tension between his wife and his son. Nathan and I found excuses to be alone whenever we could. A trip to the grocery store turned into a chance to hold hands in the car, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that made my heart race. A late-night movie in the living room ended with him pulling me onto his lap, his lips trailing down my neck as I tried and failed to keep quiet. The thrill of it all was intoxicating. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a rebellion against the life I'd been living for so long. With Nathan, I felt seen, desired, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But the secrecy was exhausting. Every time we were together, I was hyper-aware of the risks we were taking, the consequences we'd face if we were caught. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. One afternoon, Richard announced that he'd be spending the weekend at a golf retreat with some old friends. As soon as he left, the house felt lighter, freer, as though the walls themselves were giving us permission to let our guard down. Nathan found me in the garden, where I was pruning the roses. He stood at the edge of the patio, watching me with a small smile that made my chest tighten. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone teasing but with an edge of seriousness. "I've been busy," I replied, though the excuse sounded hollow even to my own ears. He stepped closer, his hands slipping into his pockets as he looked down at me. "We don't have to keep doing this, pretending like nothing's happening." I straightened, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. "What are you saying?" I'm saying, he said, stepping closer, that I don't want to pretend anymore. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he reached for me. His hands sliding around my waist as he pulled me against him. His lips found mine in a kiss that was soft but insistent, and I melted into him, the roses in the garden forgotten as the rest of the world fell away. That weekend was ours. With Richard gone, we didn't have to hide, didn't have to steal moments or glance over our shoulders. We spent lazy mornings in bed, his arms wrapped around me as sunlight filtered through the curtains. In the afternoons, we wandered the house like it was our own private sanctuary, finding new ways to explore the connection that had grown between us. One evening, we ended up in the kitchen, cooking dinner together. Nathan stood behind me, his arms circling my waist as he reached around to stir the sauce on the stove. His breath was warm against my neck, and I leaned back into him, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment. You know, he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear, this feels right. I turned to face him, my hands resting on his chest. It does, I admitted, my voice soft. But that doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't have to be easy, he said, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face. It just has to be worth it. But as much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't ignore the reality of our situation. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to keep our secret. I found myself jumping every time Richard called, my heart pounding as I wondered if he somehow knew. One night, as we lay tangled together in bed, I voiced the fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks. What if he finds out? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious. Then we deal with it, he said simply. It's not that simple, I said, my chest tightening. This could destroy everything. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. Vivian, he said, his voice steady, I'm not afraid of the truth, are you? His question lingered in the air, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond, because the truth was, I was afraid of what the truth would mean, of what it would cost us. The first close call came a week later. Richard came home early from a business meeting, walking into the house just as Nathan and I were in the kitchen, standing a little too close to each other. I pulled away quickly, my cheeks flushing as Richard glanced between us, his brow furrowed. What's going on in here? He asked, his tone light but with an edge of suspicion. Just making lunch, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Richard nodded, but the way his eyes lingered on me made my stomach churn. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, that he somehow knew what was happening right under his nose. The secrecy was starting to take its toll. I found myself second-guessing every glance, every touch, every word exchanged between Nathan and me. The thrill that had once been so intoxicating now felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. But even as the guilt and fear grew, so did my feelings for Nathan. He was everything I hadn't known I needed. Kind, attentive, passionate. With him, I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, and despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Because no matter how wrong it felt right. And I wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. The weight of our secret began to suffocate me. What had once been thrilling now felt dangerous, as if at any moment, the fragile world Nathan and I had created could come crashing down. Richard wasn't blind. His questions, his lingering glances, his subtle shifts in demeanor all told me he was starting to sense something wasn't right. I knew it was only a matter of time before he pieced it together, and the fear of that moment kept me awake at night. It all came to a head one evening, during one of Richard's rare dinners at home. He'd insisted on a family meal, saying he wanted to reconnect, though it was clear he was only going through the motions. The three of us sat around the dining table, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. So Nathan, Richard said, cutting into his steak, how's the job hunt coming along? Nathan, who had been unusually quiet all evening, glanced up, his jaw tight. It's fine, he said curtly. I've got a couple of leads. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Leads, huh? You've been here for months now. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for the perfect opportunity and start doing something useful. Nathan's hand tightened around his fork, and I saw the flicker of anger in his eyes. "I'm working on it," he said, his tone clipped. "It doesn't seem like it," Richard shot back. "You spend most of your time lounging around the house. Maybe it's time to start contributing." "That's enough," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. Both men turned to look at me, their expressions equally surprised. "There's no need to be so harsh." Richard's gaze lingered on me, his brow furrowing. "I'm just trying to help," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, and by the time it was over, I felt like I could barely breathe. Nathan disappeared upstairs, and Richard retreated to his study, leaving me alone to clean up. I stood at the sink, my hands trembling as I scrubbed the dishes, trying to push down the rising panic in my chest. Later that night, I found Nathan in the backyard, leaning against the railing of the patio. The moonlight cast a soft glow on his face, and the tension in his shoulders told me he was still stewing over the argument with Richard. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping beside him. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm fine." "You don't seem fine," I said gently. "Talk to me." He let out a bitter laugh, finally turning to face me. "What's the point? It's not like anything's going to change." "Things can change," I said, though the words felt hollow even to me. "We just have to be careful." Nathan's eyes darkened, his expression hardening. "Careful? Is that all this is to you? Something to hide?" "That's not what I meant," I said quickly, but he didn't let me finish. "Then what did you mean?" he demanded, stepping closer. "Because I'm tired of sneaking around, Vivian. I'm tired of pretending like this doesn't matter." "It does matter," I said, my voice breaking. "But this isn't just about us, Nathan. There are other people involved. Other lives." He shook his head, his frustration evident. "Other people? You mean Richard? The man who barely notices you, who spends more time on the golf course than he does with you? The man who doesn't even see you?" His words hit like a punch to the gut, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. "He's my husband," I said softly. "Whether you like it or not, he's my husband." "And what about me?" Nathan asked, his voice trembling. "What am I to you, Vivian? Just a distraction? A mistake?" The pain in his voice broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I reached for him, my hands cupping his face. "You're not a mistake," I whispered. "You could never be a mistake." For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of the truth hanging between us. And then he kissed me, his lips fierce and desperate, as if he was trying to hold on to something he knew he was about to lose. I kissed him back, pouring everything I couldn't say into that moment, but when we finally pulled apart, the reality of our situation crashed down around us. The breaking point came the next day. Richard had invited his old friend Martha over for lunch, a woman whose sharp eyes and sharper tongue had always made me uneasy. From the moment she arrived, I could feel her watching me, her gaze lingering a little too long on Nathan and me, whenever we were in the same room. "You two seem close," she said casually as we sat in the living room after lunch, her eyes flicking between Nathan and me. "It's nice to see a family getting along so well." Her words were innocent enough, but the way she said them sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the knowing glint in her eyes, but I could feel my composure slipping. Later, while I was in the kitchen, cleaning up, Martha approached me. "Vivian," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "I don't mean to pry, but is there something going on between you and Nathan?" The blood drained from my face, and I turned to her, my heart racing. "Of course not," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could think them through. "Why would you even suggest that?" She raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "I'm not blind, Vivian. The way you look at him, the way he looks at you. It's not exactly subtle." I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came. Martha's gaze softened slightly, and she sighed. "Whatever it is you're doing, you need to stop. Before it's too late." Her words haunted me for the rest of the day. I knew she was right, but stopping felt impossible. The thought of walking away from Nathan, of going back to the life I'd been living before him, felt like a death sentence. But the fear of what would happen if we didn't stop was even greater. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Richard snored softly beside me. My mind was a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and longing, and I knew something had to give. We couldn't keep going like this, not without destroying everything in the process. The truth was inevitable. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would happen when it finally came out. The day it all came crashing down started like any other. The house was quiet, the air thick with the kind of stillness that felt almost suffocating. Richard had left early for another round of golf, and Nathan had gone out to run errands. Or at least, that's what he'd told me. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the untouched toast on my plate, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to confront. Martha's words had haunted me ever since she'd confronted me in the kitchen. You need to stop, before it's too late. But stopping felt impossible. Nathan and I had gone too far, crossed too many lines to simply walk away. And yet, the weight of what we were doing was crushing me. I could feel the walls closing in, the inevitability of the truth coming to light. I didn't know it would happen that day. I didn't know everything I'd been trying to hold together would shatter before the sun went down. It started with a phone call. Richard returned home earlier than expected, his mood unusually tense as he set his golf bag down in the entryway. "Martha called me," he said, his voice clipped. My heart sank. "Oh?" I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "She mentioned that you two had an interesting conversation the other day," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "Care to explain?" I froze, my mind scrambling for a response. "It was nothing," I said quickly. "Just small talk." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Funny, because she seemed to think there was something going on between you and Nathan." The room felt like it had tilted on its axis. My throat tightened, and I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. "Vivian," Richard said, his tone dangerously calm. "I want the truth. What's been happening in this house?" Before I could answer, the door opened, and Nathan walked in. He froze when he saw us, his gaze darting between Richard and me. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could see the realization dawning on his face. "What's going on?" Nathan asked, his voice wary. "I was just about to ask the same thing," Richard said, his eyes narrowing as he turned to his son. "Care to enlighten me, Nathan? What exactly has been happening between you and my wife?" Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't respond. Then he stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "You already know, don't you?" he said, his voice steady. Richard's face contorted with anger, and he let out a bitter laugh. "You're not even going to deny it? Unbelievable." "I'm not going to lie to you," Nathan said, his tone firm. "I care about her. I love her." The words hung in the air like a bomb, and I felt my knees weaken. Richard turned to me, his face a mix of rage and disbelief. "Is that true?" he demanded. I couldn't speak. The truth was written all over my face, and Richard saw it. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he said again, his voice rising. "My wife and my son. How long has this been going on?" "Richard, please," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not. Don't," he snapped, cutting me off. "Don't try to justify this. Don't try to make this into something it's not." Nathan stepped closer, his jaw tight. "This isn't just some fling," he said. "We didn't plan for this to happen, but it did, and I'm not going to apologize for how I feel." Richard's fists clenched, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit him. But instead, he turned to me, his voice trembling with fury. "Get out," he said. "What?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Both of you," he said, his voice rising. "Get out of my house, now." The drive to Nathan's apartment was silent. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands trembling as I stared out the window. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, shame, anger, and a deep, aching sadness. I'd known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. When we arrived, Nathan helped me carry my bags inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, a far cry from the home I'd shared with Richard. But it was quiet, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. "Are you okay?" Nathan asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though it was a lie. I don't know what happens now." He stepped closer, his hand resting on my shoulder. "We figure it out," he said, "together." I looked at him, searching his face for reassurance. He looked so sure, so determined, but I wasn't. I didn't know if I had the strength to rebuild my life from the ashes of what I'd destroyed. The days that followed were a blur. Nathan and I tried to settle into a new routine, but the weight of what had happened hung over us like a storm cloud. Richard refused to speak to me, and I couldn't blame him. I'd betrayed him in the worst way possible. And I didn't know if he'd ever forgive me, or if I even deserved his forgiveness. Nathan, for his part, remained steadfast. He was my anchor in the chaos, always there with a reassuring word or a comforting touch. But I could see the strain in his eyes, the way the guilt was eating away at him too. One evening, as we sat on the couch, I turned to him, my voice trembling. "Do you think we made a mistake?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you?" I hesitated, my chest tightening. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if I can live with what we've done." Nathan reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can decide what we do next." The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I moved into a small apartment of my own, needing space to figure out who I was without Richard, without Nathan, without the life I'd known for so many years. Nathan and I stayed in touch, but the intensity of our relationship faded as we both began to process the consequences of our choices. In the quiet of my new life, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The affair with Nathan had been a catalyst, forcing me to confront the emptiness of my marriage and the parts of myself I'd been ignoring for so long. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In the end, I realized that what I needed most wasn't a relationship. It was a chance to rebuild myself, to find my own happiness on my own terms. And while I didn't know what the future held, for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally on the right path. You might want to clear out your browser history next time. The words hit me like a thunderclap. I froze, my hand mid-reach for the coffee cup on the table. When I looked up, Ethan was standing in the doorway, his lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "What?" I asked, my voice catching. He tilted his head toward the laptop on the counter, where he had been working for the past hour, fixing what I had vaguely described as sluggish performance. His gaze was steady but unreadable, and the casual way he spoke only made my stomach tighten further. "Your browser history," he said again, his tone light but deliberate. "I saw a few interesting searches." Heat rushed to my face, and I immediately turned away, fumbling for something, anything that could mask the sudden wave of embarrassment washing over me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I muttered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. He didn't push, he didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me he already knew. 3 years ago, I would have laughed at the absurdity of this situation. 3 years ago, my life was stable, predictable, and full of purpose. I was a wife, a stepmother, the matriarch of a household that revolved around family dinners, holiday traditions, and the quiet joys of ordinary days. But that was before Bill's heart attack. Before the sudden, crushing loss of the man who had been my partner, my confidant, my safe harbor. After he was gone, the house felt impossibly large, every corner echoing with the absence of his laughter. I tried to keep myself busy, gardening, volunteering, even taking up a book club, but no amount of distraction could fill the void. Nights were the hardest. Alone in bed, with only the quiet hum of the house for company, the loneliness would settle over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its weight. Ethan had been my only connection to the life I'd lost. At 28, he was everything his father had been at that age. Kind, driven, and quietly thoughtful, in ways that often caught me off guard. He visited often, checking in on me under the guise of fixing things around the house, or sharing dinner when his schedule allowed. I told myself it was just his way of honoring Bill's memory, of looking after the woman who had been a part of his family for so long. But lately, I'd started to notice things, little things, that unsettled me. The way his gaze lingered just a moment too long when we spoke. The way his hand would brush against mine when he passed me something. The way his smile felt warmer, more personal, as if it was meant only for me. And then there was me. It had started innocently enough, a late-night rabbit hole on the internet, looking up articles about loneliness and grief. But those articles had led to others, ones that delved into the complexities of relationships, the nature of intimacy, the ways we seek connection in the face of loss. The house was silent after Ethan left, and I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind was tangled, my emotions swirling in a storm of fear, longing, and something dangerously close to hope. The memory of last night was still vivid, his hands on mine, the warmth of his lips, the way he looked at me as though I was the only thing that mattered. It had been years since I felt that way, since I allowed myself to be seen so completely. But now, in the harsh light of day, reality was impossible to ignore. The world wasn't kind to people like us. People who crossed lines, who let their hearts lead them into places they weren't supposed to go. And while I'd always thought of myself as strong, resilient, capable, the thought of facing the judgment of others made me feel impossibly small. The quiet hum of the house was broken by the sound of my phone vibrating on the table. I picked it up, my heart skipping when I saw Ethan's name. "Ethan, are you okay?" The message was simple, but it carried the weight of all the emotions we hadn't yet voiced. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a reply. "I don't know, I think so." His response came almost immediately. "Ethan, can I come over later? We need to talk." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I typed, "Okay." The hours between his message and his arrival stretched endlessly. I tried to distract myself with housework, but my mind kept drifting back to him, to the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way his touch felt like both a promise and a question. When I heard his truck in the driveway, my stomach twisted with equal parts anticipation and dread. Ethan stepped inside, his expression calm but serious. He held my gaze as he crossed the room, and when he reached me, he didn't hesitate. "We need to figure this out," he said, his voice steady but gentle. I nodded, my throat tight. "I know." We sat down in the living room, the same place where everything had changed just a few nights ago. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. "I meant what I said," he began. "I'm not going anywhere. But I also know this isn't easy for you. So tell me, what are you thinking? What do you want to do?" I took a deep breath, my hands twisting together in my lap. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to be with you, but I'm scared, Ethan. I'm scared of what people will say, of what they'll think." "Do you care about what they think more than you care about us?" he asked, his tone calm but insistent. The question hit me like a punch to the chest. "Of course not," I said quickly. "But it's not that simple." "It can be," he said softly. "It's just you and me, no one else. What we feel, what we have, doesn't need anyone else's approval." His words were steady, confident, and they wrapped around me like a lifeline. But the doubts still lingered, whispering in the back of my mind. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," I said finally, my voice trembling. "You are," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I've seen it. You just have to believe it." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation and unspoken emotions. We didn't come to any decisions, but when he left, I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't facing the world alone. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight streaming through the window. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the photo of Bill on the nightstand. "I wish you were here," I whispered. "I wish you could tell me what to do." But no answer came. Only the soft rustle of the wind through the trees outside. Ethan texted me later that day, asking if he could come by. When he arrived, he stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping inside, "about us, about what's next." "What did you come up with?" I asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated, then said, "What if we leave? What if we start over somewhere new?" His suggestion took me by surprise, and I felt my breath catch. "Leave? Yeah," he said, his voice gaining strength. "A fresh start. Somewhere we don't have to worry about anyone else, just you and me." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, and I didn't know how to respond. "You don't have to decide now," he said quickly. "Just think about it." I nodded, my thoughts racing. "Okay," I said softly. That evening, I stood by the window, staring out at the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan's words echoed in my mind, filling the quiet house with their weight. I didn't know what choice I would make, or if I even had the courage to choose him. But as I watched the first stars appear in the sky, I felt something stir deep inside me, a flicker of hope, fragile but insistent. And for now, that was enough. I hadn't intended to stumble upon the kinds of things Ethan had clearly seen in my browser history. But once I had, I couldn't stop. The content wasn't salacious, at least not overtly. It was thoughtful, nuanced, written by people who understood the ache of longing and the desire to feel alive again. But knowing that didn't make it any less mortifying to realize Ethan had seen it. "I'm just teasing," he said now, breaking the tension with a grin that was both playful and disarming. "I didn't mean to embarrass you." "You didn't," I lied, forcing a tight smile as I finally turned to face him. His expression softened, and for a moment, the playful edge in his demeanor gave way to something gentler, more sincere. "It's okay, no," he said quietly. I frowned. "What is?" "To want more," he replied, his gaze steady. "To want to feel connected." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. My breath caught, and I felt a flush creep up my neck, not from embarrassment this time, but from something else. Something I couldn't quite name. "I should get back to fixing this," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. He turned back to the laptop, his shoulders relaxed, as if he hadn't just peeled back a layer of my carefully constructed walls. I stood there for a moment, watching him. The ease with which he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his movements, it all felt so familiar, and yet so different. As I picked up my coffee cup and moved to the other side of the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over again. The way he had looked at me. The way his words had lingered like a soft echo in my mind. To want more. It was such a simple statement, but it unraveled something inside me. Something I'd kept buried for far too long. And for the first time in years, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was right. The morning after Ethan's quiet observation, I tried to go about my day as usual. Breakfast, a little gardening, then a stack of laundry waiting to be folded. But my thoughts refused to cooperate. Every time I folded a shirt or reached for the watering can, his words from the night before echoed in my mind. To want more. To feel connected. It wasn't just what he'd said. It was how he'd said it. So calm, so certain, as if he understood me in a way I hadn't allowed anyone to in years. And that look in his eyes, steady and warm, had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. By mid-afternoon, I was in the kitchen, cleaning the counter for the third time, when I heard his truck pull into the driveway. "Hey," Ethan called, stepping into the house without knocking. He carried a toolbox in one hand and a small brown bag in the other. "I noticed the faucet in the bathroom dripping yesterday," he said, setting the toolbox on the counter. "Thought I'd come by and take care of it before it gets worse." "You didn't have to do that," I said, though my heart skipped a beat at his thoughtfulness. "It's no trouble," he replied, flashing that easy smile of his. As he unpacked the tools, I noticed the brown bag on the counter. "What's that?" I asked. "Oh," he said, almost sheepishly. "I stopped by the bakery on the way over. Thought you might like a muffin or two." He pulled out 2 oversized muffins, one blueberry, one chocolate chip, and set them on a plate. The gesture was small, almost inconsequential, but it sent a warmth through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. I watched as he worked on the faucet, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, capable arms. His movements were efficient, confident, and I found myself transfixed in a way that felt dangerous. "You know," he said without looking up, "you should really let me help out around here more often." I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms. "You're already here half the time. Any more, and I'd have to start charging you rent." He laughed, the sound rich and warm, and for a moment it felt like the house itself had come alive. "Fair enough," he said, turning to face me. "But seriously, I like being here. It's nice." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. "Well, you're always welcome," I said softly, my voice faltering. Later, after the faucet was fixed and the muffins eaten, we found ourselves sitting in the living room, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Ethan leaned back on the couch, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "You know," he began, his tone casual, "I've been thinking about what you said the other day." "What did I say?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. "About not needing much help around here," he said, his gaze steady. "I don't think that's true." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I think you're so used to doing everything on your own that you don't realize how much you could use someone to lean on." His words struck a nerve, and I felt my defenses rise. "I've been managing just fine," I said, a little sharper than I intended. I know you have, he said gently. But that doesn't mean you have to. The softness in his voice, the way he looked at me like he truly saw me, made my chest tighten. I looked away, suddenly unable to hold his gaze. As the day wore on, the air between us seemed to shift. It wasn't tense, exactly, but it was charged, as if something unspoken lingered just beneath the surface. When it was time for him to leave, he stood by the door, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Thanks for letting me hang out today," he said, his voice light but his eyes serious. "You make it sound like I had a choice," I replied, trying to lighten the mood. His smile softened, and for a moment he just looked at me. "I'll see you soon," he said finally, his voice low. As he stepped outside, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day's events over and over in my mind. The way his voice had softened when he said my name, the warmth of his smile, the intensity of his gaze. It was impossible what I was feeling, ridiculous even. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, the truth was undeniable. Ethan made me feel seen. He made me feel alive. And that terrified me. Ethan came over the next evening, unannounced, but carrying the same effortless ease he always did. This time he brought a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, holding them up with a grin. "I figured we could celebrate my handiwork on the faucet," he said as he stepped into the kitchen. I laughed despite myself, shaking my head. "A dripping faucet isn't exactly cause for celebration, Ethan." "Maybe not," he replied, setting the bottle on the counter. "But any excuse to spend some time together works for me." His words made my chest tighten, but I brushed it off, busying myself with finding the corkscrew. "Fine," I said, keeping my tone light. "But you're pouring." We ended up on the porch, the bottle of wine resting on the small table between us. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in soft purples and oranges. A warm breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and for a while, we simply sat there, talking about nothing and everything. Ethan told me about a new project at work, his voice animated as he described the details. I listened, smiling at his enthusiasm, but my thoughts kept drifting to the way the fading light played across his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the warmth in his eyes. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, his glass in hand, and looked at me with a soft smile. "You know, you should get out of the house more," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing bad," he replied quickly. "I just mean, you spend so much time here, keeping everything the way it's always been. But there's a whole world out there, you deserve to see it." His words stirred something in me, a mixture of longing and resistance. "This is my home," I said quietly. "It's where I feel safe." "I get that," he said, his voice gentle. "But maybe it's time to feel something more than just safe." The way he said it, calm, deliberate, and so full of meaning, left me momentarily speechless. I looked down at my glass, swirling the wine as I tried to collect my thoughts. Later, as the night deepened, we moved back inside. The house felt cozier in the dim light, the warm glow from the living room lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan stretched out on the couch, his arm draped casually over the backrest, while I perched on the edge of the armchair, trying to ignore the pull I felt toward him. "You always sit so far away," he said, his tone teasing. "I'm perfectly comfortable here," I replied, though the slight tremor in my voice betrayed me. He tilted his head, studying me with that same steady gaze that always seemed to unravel me. "You're allowed to be close to me, you know? I don't bite." His words sent a shiver through me, but I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "I'm fine where I am, Ethan." "All right," he said softly, though his eyes never left mine. As the conversation drifted into quieter territory, the air between us seemed to grow heavier, charged with something unspoken. I could feel his gaze on me, and though I tried to focus on the glass in my hands, my heart raced with every passing moment. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my tone as steady as I could. "About doing everything on your own," he replied. "About not letting anyone help." I frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What about it?" "I think you're scared," he said simply. The bluntness of his words took me by surprise, and I felt my chest tighten. "Scared of what?" "Of letting someone in," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. of letting yourself want something more. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He was right, and we both knew it. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to be," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not with me." The vulnerability in his words, the quiet plea in his tone, broke something inside me. I set my glass down on the table, my hands trembling, and looked at him. "Ethan," I began, but I didn't know how to finish. He stood, crossing the room in a few short steps, and crouched in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Just let me show you." His hands moved slowly, hesitantly, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. When his lips met mine, it was like the world tilted on its axis. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, becoming something neither of us could control. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, every doubt and hesitation dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan rested his forehead against mine, his hands still holding me as if he was afraid to let go. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. I closed my eyes, my hands gripping his arms as I tried to steady myself. "This is crazy," I whispered. "Maybe," he said, his lips brushing against my temple. "But it feels right." His words sent a shiver through me, and I knew he was right. It did feel right, no matter how much I wanted to deny it. That night, after he left, I sat alone in the living room, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin. I knew we'd crossed a line, one we couldn't uncross, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me like a stone. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was something else. A flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next morning, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched cup of coffee. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt more oppressive than comforting, and my thoughts were anything but calm. Ethan's kiss lingered in my mind like the echo of a melody I couldn't forget. The warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, it was all too vivid, too real. I couldn't deny what had happened or the way it had made me feel, but I also couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. When the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway broke through the quiet, my heart skipped a beat. I stood quickly, my hands smoothing over my shirt as if I could somehow prepare myself for whatever came next. He stepped inside, his smile soft but uncertain, as if he wasn't sure how I'd react to him today. "Morning," he said, his voice calm but tentative. "Morning," I replied, my tone quieter than I intended. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, thick with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. "I thought we could finish the movie we started the other night," he said finally, holding up a DVD case he'd brought with him. It was such a simple suggestion, so ordinary, and yet it carried an unspoken message that made my chest tighten. He wasn't going to push me, wasn't going to force me to confront what had happened before I was ready. "Sure," I said, forcing a small smile. We sat on the couch, the movie playing quietly in the background as the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. Ethan sat close, closer than he normally would have, and though his hand didn't touch mine, I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me. I tried to focus on the movie, on the characters and the dialogue, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before, to the way his lips had felt against mine, to the way he had looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. I looked at him startled. "What? You seem distracted," he said, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, my hands twisting together in my lap. "I just have a lot on my mind," I admitted finally. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Is it about last night?" I froze, my breath catching. "Ethan, it's okay," he said quickly, his tone soothing. "I'm not trying to make this harder for you. I need to know where we stand." His honesty, his vulnerability was both comforting and terrifying. I looked away, my eyes falling to the floor. "I don't know," I said softly. "I don't know what this is or what it means. All I know is that it's complicated." "I know it is," he said, leaning forward slightly, "but it doesn't have to be, not if we don't let it." Before I could respond, his hand brushed against mine, a small tentative gesture that sent a shiver through me. I looked up, and the intensity in his gaze made my heart race. "I care about you," he said quietly, "more than I probably should. And I know you feel the same." I opened my mouth to deny it, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. He was right, and we both knew it. "You make me feel alive," I whispered finally, my voice trembling. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm more than just this empty shell of a person." "Because you are," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're more than you give yourself credit for, and you deserve to be happy." The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over, and I felt his hand tighten around mine, grounding me in the moment. When he leaned in, I didn't pull away. His lips met mine in a kiss that was both soft and urgent, filled with all the emotions we hadn't been able to put into words. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself give in, the last of my resistance crumbling under the weight of my longing. His touch was gentle but insistent, his hands exploring me with a reverence that made my breath catch. I felt his warmth, his strength, and for the first time in years, I let myself be vulnerable. The world outside faded into nothingness, leaving only the sound of our breaths and the steady rhythm of our hearts. Every kiss, every touch was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to face the world by myself anymore. Afterward, we sat together on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. His arm was draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "I think so," I said, my voice barely audible. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his hold on me tightening. "I'm glad," he murmured. The quiet between us was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos of my thoughts. I didn't know what the future held, or if this was something we could sustain. But in that moment, with his arms around me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. When he left that evening, the house felt quieter than it ever had before. I stood by the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the driveway, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something new. Something terrifying. Something wonderful. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were both exhilarating and excruciating. Ethan continued to visit, always with a reason. A leaky faucet, a faulty light switch, or just the excuse of sharing a meal. But each time the unspoken weight of what had happened between us hung in the air. We didn't talk about that night, not directly. Instead, our connection deepened in the quiet moments. The way his hand would linger on mine when passing a dish, the way his eyes would follow me across the room, the way his smile seemed softer, more intimate. But I could feel the dam breaking. Every glance, every touch, every stolen moment was building toward something neither of us could control. It was a Friday evening when it finally happened. Ethan had come over to fix the loose railing on the back porch. The sun was setting, casting the yard in golden light, and I watched him from the kitchen window as he worked, his movements precise and efficient. There was something hypnotic about the way he moved, the quiet confidence he exuded. I told myself to stop staring, to focus on the vegetables I was chopping for dinner, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. When he finally came inside, he was sweaty and disheveled, but his smile was as warm as ever. "All done," he announced, wiping his hands on a towel I handed him. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer than I intended. His eyes lingered on mine for a moment, and I felt my breath hitch. "Dinner smells good," he said, breaking the silence. "Almost ready," I replied, turning back to the cutting board. But before I could pick up the knife, I felt his hand on my arm, stopping me. I turned to face him, and the intensity in his gaze made my chest tighten. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Of course." We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the bottle of wine I'd opened earlier untouched between us. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his hands clasped together. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ethan?" I began, but he held up a hand, stopping me. "Let me finish," he said softly. I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know this is complicated," he continued. I know there are a million reasons why we shouldn't do this, why it doesn't make sense, but none of that changes how I feel about you." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, my chest tightening as the weight of his confession settled over me. "I don't know how to make this work," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't even know if it's possible." "It is," he said firmly, "if we want it to be." I looked away, my eyes falling to the table. "People would never understand," I said softly. "Let them think what they want," he replied. "This isn't about them, it's about us." Before I could respond, he stood, moving around the table to crouch in front of me. His hands rested on my knees, his touch warm and grounding. "I care about you," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering, "more than I've ever cared about anyone, and I know you feel the same, even if you're afraid to admit it." His words broke something inside me, and I felt the first tear slip down my cheek. "Ethan, it's too much," I whispered. "It's not," he said, his hands tightening on mine. "It's exactly what it's supposed to be. You just have to let yourself believe it." When he kissed me, it wasn't hesitant or tentative. It was raw, unrestrained, filled with all the emotions we'd been holding back for so long. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself give in, the last of my resistance crumbling. We moved without thought, our bodies tangling together as the world around us faded into nothingness. His touch was reverent yet insistent, his lips tracing a path across my skin that left me breathless. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Truly, deeply alive. The hours passed in a blur of warmth and connection. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word weaving a tapestry of intimacy that left no room for doubt. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. His arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "I think so," I said, my voice barely audible. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, his hold on me tightening. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, the weight of what we'd done began to settle over me. I stood by the window, watching the early sunlight spill across the yard, and felt a mixture of emotions I couldn't untangle. Ethan joined me, his arms wrapping around my waist as he rested his chin on my shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Everything," I admitted. He pressed a kiss to my temple. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." I wanted to believe him, to let myself lean into the warmth of his promise. But the doubts lingered, whispering in the back of my mind. When he left later that morning, I sat alone in the living room, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin. I knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of that realization pressed down on me like a stone. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was something else. A flicker of hope, fragile but steady. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something new. Something terrifying. Something wonderful. And for now, that was enough.